It wasn't Sarah, it was a firefighter. "Dr. Carter, it's your house. There's been a fire. Your son, he's in critical condition." It felt like my heart stopped. My ears were ringing, and the walls of the hospital hallway seemed to close in on me. The firefighter kept talking, something about smoke inhalation, about how they managed to pull Noah out in time but he was barely breathing. I couldn't focus on the words. All I could think about was Noah's face, his big brown eyes, his crooked little smile, and the way he'd hugged me just that morning before school. I don't remember driving to the hospital. I must have run red lights and broken every speed limit because the next thing I knew, I was sprinting down the pediatric ICU hallway. Sarah was already there, sitting by Noah's bed. She looked up at me, her face pale and streaked with mascara. Noah was lying there, motionless, tubes running from his tiny body, his chest barely rising under the weight of the machines keeping him alive. The attending doctor pulled me aside. They needed to do a blood transfusion immediately. Noah was weak, and time was running out. Without even thinking, I offered to donate my blood. I would have given him every drop if it meant he'd open his eyes again. They took my blood sample. Sarah and I sat side by side in silence as the machines beeped and hissed. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say. When the doctor came back, he was holding my chart, and his expression made my stomach drop. He hesitated, glancing at Sarah, then back at me. His voice was steady, but there was something tight about the way he spoke. "Dr. Carter, you're not a match." It was one sentence. One sentence that punched me so hard in the chest I felt like I couldn't breathe. I managed to croak out a question. I asked him how that was possible, how I could not be a match for my own son. He didn't have an answer. He just gave me this pitying look, like he already knew what was happening even if I couldn't piece it together yet. I turned to Sarah. She wouldn't look at me. Her head was down, her hand gripping Noah's little fingers so tightly her knuckles were white. Noah got the transfusion he needed from an anonymous donor. He stabilized, but the damage was done. Not just to him, but to me, to us. Something had shifted, something irreparable. In the days that followed, I stayed at the hospital with Noah. I barely slept. Sarah tried to talk to me a few times, tried to explain, but I wouldn't let her. I couldn't hear her voice without feeling sick. I told myself I'd deal with her later. Right now, Noah was all that mattered. When Noah was finally stable enough for me to leave his side, I went back to what was left of our home. The house was a mess, charred walls, broken glass, the smell of smoke still clinging to everything. The fire department had managed to salvage some of our belongings, but most of it was ruined. While sorting through the wreckage, I found it. A small, fireproof safe hidden under the floorboards of our bedroom closet. I didn't even recognize it at first. I don't remember us buying one. But it was locked, and the combination was familiar. It was Sarah's birthday. The safe clicked open, and inside was something I wish I'd never seen. Stacks of cash, prepaid burner phones, and photos. Photos of Sarah, intimate, graphic photos, with another man. My hands were shaking as I pulled out Noah's birth certificate from the pile of papers. Father, Adam. Adam. My best friend. Adam, who died in a car accident 2 years ago. Adam, who had been like a brother to me, who had been at my wedding, who had held Noah as a baby. I sat down right there on the cold, charred floor of what used to be our bedroom. I stared at those photos, at that birth certificate, and I felt something crack open inside me. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was something heavier, something colder. Sarah didn't just betray me, she made a fool of me. She let me believe I was Noah's father. She let me build a life on a lie. But I didn't break down. I didn't scream or punch a wall. I sat there for hours, staring at those photos, at the damning evidence of everything I'd lost. When I finally stood up, I knew one thing for certain: Sarah wasn't going to get away with this. She wasn't going to walk away unscathed. After the fire, after the hospital, after the doctor told me I wasn't Noah's biological father, everything felt like static. White noise buzzing in the background of every moment. I couldn't eat. Couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Sarah's face, her tears, her downcast eyes, the way she couldn't meet my gaze when the doctor said those words. you're not a match." I spent hours by Noah's side in the hospital, clutching his little hand, feeling like a fraud. But at the same time, he was still my son. He was still the boy who ran into my arms after school, who made drawings of us together, who called me Dad. I refused to let go of that, no matter what. Sarah tried to talk to me a few times in those early days. Soft, hesitant attempts to explain herself, but I couldn't hear her. Not then. Not when everything inside me felt like it was about to crack open. When Noah was finally stable enough for me to step away for a few hours, I went back to the ruins of our home. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I'd find something, some sign, some answer, some clue to make sense of everything. The house was nothing but a charred skeleton. Blackened walls, ash-covered floors, the smell of smoke soaked into every surface. But somehow, the closet in our bedroom had survived. The firefighters told me it was one of the few areas the fire didn't reach. I don't know what made me look under the floorboards. I'd never noticed them before, small panels of wood cut slightly differently than the rest. But there they were. And underneath them, the safe. It was a small, fireproof box, dusty but intact. The combination was Sarah's birthday. I don't even know why I tried it, it just felt obvious in that moment. When the door clicked open, I felt my stomach tighten. I knew, deep down, that whatever was inside wasn't going to make me feel better. Stacks of cash. Prepaid phones. And photos. Photos of Sarah with another man. Intimate photos. Explicit photos. I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. My hands shook as I flipped through them, each one a fresh knife to the chest. There were dates scribbled on the back of some of them. Years ago. Long before Adam's death. And then I found Noah's birth certificate. Father, Adam. I must have sat there for hours, staring at those pieces of paper. My mind kept trying to make excuses, trying to piece together some explanation that didn't involve my wife, the woman I'd built a life with, betraying me in the most profound way imaginable. But there was no excuse. No explanation. Just cold, hard facts staring me in the face. Sarah and Adam. My best friend. My wife. And Noah. No. I couldn't let myself go there. Not yet. When I finally left the house, the sun was starting to set, painting the sky in orange and pink. It felt wrong, like the world shouldn't be so beautiful when everything inside me felt shattered. I didn't go back to the hospital right away. I couldn't. I needed time to process, to breathe, to figure out what came next. Instead, I drove aimlessly. Hours passed, and eventually, I ended up parked outside a coffee shop. I sat there, staring at nothing, trying to make sense of everything. At some point, I realized I couldn't avoid Sarah forever. I had to face her. I had to hear her side, even if I already knew the truth. When I walked back into the hospital room that night, Sarah was sitting beside Noah's bed, her head resting on her folded arms. She looked up when she heard me come in, her face tired and streaked with tears. I didn't say anything. I just sat down in the chair across the room, staring at her. She started talking. Her voice was quiet, shaky. She told me about Adam. How it started, how it went on for years. She said it wasn't supposed to happen, that she never meant to hurt me, that she buried the truth deep down because she couldn't bear to lose the life we built. But those weren't answers. They weren't good enough. She tried to justify it. Said Adam was lonely. Said she was lonely. Said they both made a mistake and then made another and another until it became something they couldn't stop. I sat there, silent, letting her words wash over me like rain on glass. She admitted that she suspected Noah might not be mine from the beginning. But she chose not to find out. She said it was easier to believe he was mine, easier to pretend. I wanted to scream at her, to ask her how she could do this to me, to us. How she could let me fall in love with a son who might never have been mine to begin with. But I didn't say anything. I just got up and walked out of the room. I went back to Noah's side later that night, after Sarah had left. I sat beside him, holding his hand, watching him sleep. He was still my son. No matter what Sarah or Adam had done, Noah was mine. But Sarah. Sarah had crossed a line I couldn't ignore. I didn't confront her again. Not yet. Instead, I started planning. I spoke to a lawyer the next day. Quietly, carefully, making sure Sarah wouldn't suspect a thing. I wanted everything ready before I made my move. Sarah thought she could explain this away. She thought her tears and her apologies would fix it. But there's no fixing something like this. Not when the foundation of your entire life was built on a lie. And I was going to make sure she felt every ounce of that betrayal when the time came. But first, I had to make sure Noah was okay. Everything else could wait. After days of silence and planning, I couldn't avoid Sarah anymore. The weight of everything I knew felt like a stone tied to my chest. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every moment I spent sitting by Noah's hospital bed felt like a cruel joke, like I was living someone else's life. Sarah kept hovering around me, trying to talk, trying to catch my eye, but I shut her out every time. I think that silence was driving her insane. She'd flinch every time I walked past her without saying a word, and I could tell she was unraveling. But eventually, the silence had to break. I couldn't keep swallowing the anger, the disgust, the humiliation. It happened late one night. Noah was asleep in his hospital bed, and Sarah and I were sitting in the small family waiting room just outside the ICU. It was quiet, the kind of heavy silence that feels like it's pressing down on your chest. Sarah was picking at a frayed thread on her sweater, her knees pulled up close to her chest. She looked small. Guilty. But not enough. I asked her one question. Just one. Why? At first, she tried to cry. Her face crumpled, her shoulders started shaking, and for a second, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then she started talking, and whatever pity I felt was gone in an instant. She said it wasn't supposed to happen. That it started when Adam was going through a rough time, and she was lonely. That I was always at work, always busy saving other people's lives while she was home, feeling like nothing more than a shadow. She said Adam understood her. He listened to her. He made her feel seen. I remember staring at her, feeling something boil under my skin. She wasn't apologizing, she was explaining, like she thought any of this made sense, like it was somehow my fault for working too much, for being a surgeon and trying to build a life for us. She said it was never serious. That Adam was just a mistake that kept happening. I asked her if she ever loved him. She hesitated. That pause said everything. But then she kept going, her voice growing sharper, more defensive. She said I was always so perfect, so focused on being the good husband and the good father that I never stopped to see her. That she felt like an accessory to my perfect little life. It was like watching someone dig their own grave with every word. She said she suspected Noah might not be mine when she was pregnant, but she didn't want to know for sure. She said she was scared that if she told me, I'd leave. That I'd look at her differently. She started crying again, real tears this time, and said she loved me. She said she chose me. That she could have run off with Adam, but she didn't. She stayed. And she said that counted for something. That was when I lost it, not in a loud, screaming way, but in a way that made my voice cold and sharp. I told her that choosing me wasn't some noble act of love. It wasn't a sacrifice. She didn't choose me, she trapped me. She let me believe Noah was mine, let me build my entire world around that little boy, while she carried this secret like a time bomb strapped to her chest. She started crying harder, but I didn't stop. I asked her if she ever thought about what would happen if I found out. If she ever wondered what it would do to me, to Noah. She said she thought she could keep it buried forever. Buried. That was the word she used, like this was some old box of junk she'd stuffed into the attic and hoped no one would ever notice. She kept talking after that, kept trying to explain herself, but it all started blending together, excuses, justifications, empty words that felt like paper-thin shields against the truth. And then she said something that made me freeze. She said Adam was dead. That it didn't matter anymore. That I was still Noah's father in every way that counted. I had to walk away. I couldn't listen to her anymore. I went back into Noah's room and sat down beside his bed. He was still asleep, his small chest rising and falling under the thin hospital blanket. Sarah came in a few minutes later. She stood at the doorway, arms crossed over her chest like she was trying to hold herself together. She said we could fix this. That we could go to therapy, start over, rebuild. I didn't answer her. I couldn't. Because there was nothing left to rebuild. The fire hadn't just taken our house, it had burned through everything between us. Every promise, every memory, every moment that used to mean something. Sarah wasn't done talking, though. She said she was scared I'd take Noah away from her. That I'd cut her out of his life. It was the first time I saw it, the fear. Not guilt, not regret, but real fear. And in that moment, I realized she knew. She knew I wasn't going to forgive her. She knew something was coming, even if she couldn't see the shape of it yet. For days after that, she kept trying. She sent me long text messages, voice notes, emails. Half apologies, half self-pity. She said she was sorry, but then she'd twist it back around to herself, how scared she was, how alone she felt, how much she loved me despite everything. I didn't respond to any of them. I was done talking. Instead, I focused on Noah. I stayed by his side as much as I could, holding his hand, reading him stories, pretending everything was fine even though it wasn't. But every time I looked at Sarah across the hospital room, I could see it, the cracks forming in her carefully constructed facade. The guilt was eating her alive, but so was the fear. She knew something was coming. And she was right. The days at the hospital turned into weeks. Noah was stable but still fragile, and every small improvement felt like a victory. His burns were healing slowly, and the doctors said his lungs were responding well to treatment. But he still hadn't woken up. Every day, I sat by his bed, holding his hand, talking to him, telling him stories he probably couldn't hear. Sarah was there too, hovering nearby like a ghost. She'd sit across the room, avoiding my eyes, trying to find moments to speak to me. But I kept the space between us thick and heavy with silence. I wasn't ready to hear her voice, not when every word from her mouth felt like it carried another layer of betrayal. The ICU wasn't quiet. Machines beeped constantly, nurses shuffled in and out, and somewhere down the hall, someone was always crying. But none of it felt real to me. It was like I was underwater, hearing everything muffled and distant. Noah shared his ICU room with another boy, Liam. I hadn't paid much attention to him at first. My world had shrunk down to the space between my chair and Noah's bed. But one night, when the lights were dim and the nurses had stopped making rounds, I noticed Liam's mother sitting by his side. She looked exhausted. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her clothes were wrinkled, and there were dark circles under her eyes. But there was something steady about her, a quiet determination in the way she held Liam's hand and whispered softly to him. Liam was small, even smaller than Noah. His arm was in a cast, and there were faint bruises on his face, fading from deep purple to yellow. He was sleeping, his small chest rising and falling slowly under the thin hospital blanket. I didn't speak to her that night. I just watched from the corner of my eye as she sat there, her hand resting gently on Liam's arm, her head bowed slightly. Over the next few days, I started noticing more about them. Liam would wake up sometimes, his small voice barely above a whisper as he asked his mother for water or for her to read him a story. Claire, that was her name, would smile softly, her voice calm and steady as she reassured him. It wasn't until one evening, when I was stepping out into the hallway for some air, that I actually spoke to her. Claire was standing by the window at the end of the corridor, staring out at the city lights. She looked over at me, gave a small, tired smile, and then turned back to the window. We didn't talk much at first. Just polite acknowledgements, nods, and faint smiles in passing. But eventually, we started having brief conversations in the hallway or by the vending machine. I learned that Liam had been in a car accident. A drunk driver had slammed into their car at an intersection. Liam had been in the back seat, and the impact had shattered his arm and caused internal injuries. Claire had walked away with just a few bruises, but she said it didn't feel fair, how she was fine while Liam was lying in a hospital bed. She told me about the medical bills stacking up. How her insurance wasn't covering everything. How she'd had to take unpaid leave from work to stay by Liam's side. She wasn't complaining. She wasn't asking for pity. She was just talking. Like she needed someone to hear her. I started noticing little things. Her phone screen was cracked, The edges of her shoes were worn, and her backpack, where she kept a few essentials, had a broken zipper she'd tried to fix with safety pins. One afternoon, I overheard her talking to one of the nurses about Liam's medications. The nurse was explaining that some of them weren't covered by insurance and that Claire would need to pay out of pocket. I saw the way Claire's shoulders slumped slightly, the way she nodded and forced a smile even though she was clearly overwhelmed. That night, I slipped a small envelope of cash into her backpack while she was out of the room. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough to cover the medications and maybe a little extra. I didn't say anything to her about it. I wasn't looking for thanks or acknowledgement. I just couldn't stand by and watch her struggle while I had the means to help. Over the next few days, I kept finding quiet ways to help. I'd leave gift cards for the hospital cafeteria at the nurse's station with her name on them. I'd pay for Liam's prescriptions ahead of time so Claire wouldn't have to worry about it. Claire figured it out eventually. She cornered me in the hallway one evening, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her voice quiet but firm. She said she didn't want charity. I told her it wasn't charity. It was just something I needed to do. Helping her felt easier than thinking about everything else. It gave me something to focus on, something that wasn't Sarah, or Adam, or the mess of my life waiting for me outside the hospital walls. Claire didn't argue after that. She just nodded and walked away. We started talking more after that night. Not about anything heavy, just small, simple conversations about Liam, about Noah, about the weather. We sat together in the waiting room sometimes, sipping bad coffee from paper cups and staring out the window at the parking lot below. Claire was kind. Steady. And in a way, she reminded me of who I used to be before everything fell apart. But I wasn't ready to be anything more than someone sitting in a hospital chair, waiting for my son to wake up. And Claire wasn't looking for anything either. She was just trying to keep her son alive, just like I was. But outside those hospital walls, there was still Sarah. There was still the truth, still the slow-burning anger that hadn't gone away. Hospitals have a strange way of becoming familiar. The fluorescent lights, the faint smell of antiseptic, the quiet hum of machines, it all starts to feel normal after a while. Days blend into nights, and time loses its edges. It felt like I lived there, floating between Noah's room and the waiting area, always carrying the tight knot of exhaustion and dread in my chest. Claire and I kept crossing paths. At first, it was small things, waiting for coffee in the cafeteria line, passing each other in the hallway, or sitting silently in the ICU waiting room when sleep refused to come. It didn't feel strange or forced. It was just easy. Like we were two people who had quietly agreed to exist alongside each other without demanding too much. One evening, I walked into the waiting room after a long day by Noah's side and found Claire sitting in one of the stiff chairs, staring down at a crossword puzzle. She had one of those tiny hospital pens in her hand, chewing on the cap as she squinted at the paper. I sat down across from her without thinking much about it, letting out a sigh that felt like it had been building up for weeks. She looked up, her face breaking into a small smile, and pointed her pen at me. 8-letter word for foolish mistake. I didn't know if she was actually asking me or just thinking out loud, but I answered anyway. Marriage. She snorted, loud enough that a passing nurse gave her a quick side eye. She covered her mouth, laughing into her palm, and I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks, lightness. It wasn't a big moment. It wasn't significant. But for a few seconds, the weight on my shoulders felt a little bit smaller. After that, our conversations became more frequent. Sometimes we'd talk about the little things, hospital food, weather, how the vending machine was somehow always out of the good chips. Other times, we'd sit in silence, sipping coffee from those terrible little paper cups, both staring out the same smudged window overlooking the parking lot. Neither of us ever crossed a line. There were no deep confessions, no teary breakdowns, no grand gestures. Just quiet moments, little exchanges that felt warm in a place that was otherwise so cold and sterile. One afternoon, I caught her trying to wrestle a folding chair out from the corner of the waiting room. It was stuck between two other chairs, and she was pulling at it with this fierce determination, her ponytail bobbing with every tug. I stood there watching for a minute before stepping forward and casually lifting it out with one hand. She looked up at me, her face flushed, and said something under her breath that sounded suspiciously like, "Show off." For the first time in weeks, I smiled, really smiled. But it wasn't all light moments. Sometimes, I'd see Claire sitting by Liam's bed with her head bowed, her shoulders trembling, and I'd quietly slip away, giving her space. Other times, she'd find me sitting by Noah's side, staring blankly at his pale face, and she'd quietly leave a cup of coffee on the windowsill before walking away. We never said much about those moments. We didn't need to. Meanwhile, Sarah was falling apart. I started getting texts from mutual friends and colleagues. Apparently, Sarah had taken a leave of absence from work. People were talking, whispers about her odd behavior, about how she looked like she hadn't slept in weeks, about how she was breaking down in the middle of conversations. She tried to talk to me almost every day. Sometimes she'd corner me in the hospital hallway, her voice trembling as she tried to explain herself. Other times, she'd send me long, rambling messages, apologies mixed with excuses, all wrapped in desperation. She said she was sorry. She said she'd made a mistake, that she hadn't wanted things to turn out this way. She promised she'd do whatever it took to fix our marriage, to make things right. But I didn't respond. I couldn't. Every time I looked at her, I saw Adam. I saw those photos. I saw the birth certificate with his name printed next to Noah's. So I gave her nothing. No anger, no yelling, no confrontation. Just silence. And that silence became her punishment. Sarah started showing up at the hospital at odd hours, her face pale and drawn, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She'd sit in the corner of Noah's room, wringing her hands, glancing at me every few seconds like she was waiting for me to say something, anything. But I wouldn't give her that. One night, I found her sitting outside Noah's room on the floor, her knees pulled up to her chest, her face buried in her arms. I stepped over her without saying a word and walked inside. I think that hurt her more than if I'd screamed at her. Claire noticed Sarah too. She never said anything about it, but I could tell she was piecing things together. She'd glance at Sarah sometimes, her lips pressed into a thin line, and then she'd look away. But she never asked. Claire wasn't someone who pried. She was just there. Steady. Quiet. I started looking forward to our conversations, to those little pockets of normalcy in the middle of the chaos. One night, we both ended up at the vending machine at the same time, and the stupid thing ate my dollar. Without missing a beat, Claire stepped up, smacked the side of the machine twice, and a bag of chips fell out. She handed them to me with a completely straight face and said, "You're welcome." For the first time in what felt like forever, I laughed. A real laugh. Sarah kept trying. Her texts became more frantic, her apologies more desperate. She started leaving voicemails, her voice cracking as she begged me to talk to her. But I stayed silent. Time moved differently after Noah started getting better. At first, it was the little things, his eyes fluttering open, his weak voice calling for me. Then it was his laughter, faint but real, cracking through the heavy silence of the hospital room like sunlight breaking through clouds. Liam was recovering too, and every day brought small victories, sitting up, walking short distances, smiling at Claire as she read him stories. Eventually, both boys were cleared to go home. I remember the day Noah was discharged, his small hand gripped mine tightly as I helped him into the wheelchair. He was still weak, still healing, but his smile was wide, his eyes bright. Claire and Liam left the hospital a week later, and we all said goodbye in the parking lot. It was brief and quiet. Liam gave Noah a shy wave, Claire offered me a small smile, and then they were gone. The silence in my car on the drive home felt heavier than it should have. The house we moved into, small, rented, but clean and warm, was nothing like the one we'd lost. But it didn't matter. Noah was home, and that was enough. Sarah tried to reach out a few more times after that. A handful of texts, an email, 1 or 2 missed calls. I didn't respond. I'd already decided I was going to fight for full custody of Noah, and my lawyer assured me the evidence we'd collected, everything from her affair with Adam to her negligence in hiding the truth, would work in my favor. I focused on Noah. His recovery wasn't easy. The nightmares came almost every night, and there were moments when he'd stare off into space, his little body trembling as if he could still feel the heat of the flames. I stayed by his side through it all, holding him when he cried, reading him stories until he fell asleep, and trying to make our new house feel like home. Somewhere along the way, I started texting Claire. At first, it was just updates about Noah. Then she started sending me little updates about Liam. His first day back at school. The drawing he made in class. It felt natural, like an unspoken rhythm we'd fallen into. Christmas was approaching faster than I realized. It hit me one evening as I was flipping through the channels on TV and saw an old Christmas movie playing, the kind where everyone's sitting around a fireplace, drinking hot cocoa, and everything feels perfect. Our house wasn't perfect. But it was quiet and warm. The tree Noah and I set up was a little crooked, with mismatched ornaments, but it glowed softly in the corner of the living room. One afternoon, as snow started falling softly outside, I picked up my phone and sent Claire a message. I asked her if she and Liam would like to spend Christmas Eve with us. She hesitated at first, I could tell from how long it took her to reply. But eventually, she said yes. When they arrived on Christmas Eve, Noah and Liam were inseparable. They ran around the living room, building pillow forts and tearing open small gifts I'd picked up for Liam earlier that week. The snow outside was still falling, blanketing everything in white, and the house felt full. Not perfect, not fixed, but full. Claire brought a pie she'd made, still warm from the oven. I brewed coffee while she set it down on the kitchen counter. We stood there for a moment, just the two of us, as the boys' laughter echoed from the next room. The evening felt fragile, like it could break apart if either of us said the wrong thing. But neither of us spoke much. We didn't need to. Later that night, the boys were bundled up in their coats and gloves, playing in the snow-covered yard. Their faces were red from the cold, but they were laughing, really laughing, and for a while, I let myself believe everything might turn out okay. Claire was standing beside me by the window, holding a mug of tea in both hands. The soft glow from the Christmas tree lights reflected off the glass, and her face looked calm, almost peaceful. I don't know what came over me, but I turned to her. It wasn't planned, it wasn't dramatic, it just happened. I leaned in and kissed her. It was hesitant, gentle, like neither of us was sure if we should be doing it. But she didn't pull away. It lasted only a moment before we both stepped back, eyes darting away awkwardly. Claire turned her attention back to the boys outside, her fingers tightening around the mug in her hands. I stayed silent, my heart hammering in my chest. The night went on. We sat together by the fire while the boys played with their toys. We didn't talk about the kiss. We didn't talk about what it meant, or where it might lead. When Claire and Liam were getting ready to leave later that night, I walked them to their car. The snow was still falling, and our breath hung in the air in little clouds. As Liam climbed into the back seat, I asked her if she'd ever thought about moving in with us. Her and Liam, here with me and Noah. Claire froze. Her hand was still on the car door handle, and she didn't meet my eyes. She said she couldn't. She said she'd been hurt before, that she couldn't risk ruining what we'd built, the small, fragile connection we had. I could see the hesitation in her eyes, the way she wanted to say something more, but she didn't. She got into the car, gave me one last look, and then drove away. The next day, my lawyer called. The court had ruled in my favor. I was granted full custody of Noah, and Sarah was given limited, supervised visitation rights. It should have felt like a victory. And in some ways, it did. But it didn't erase everything. That night, after Noah fell asleep, I stood by the window in the living room, staring out at the snow-covered yard. It felt quiet, too quiet. Claire had been right. What we had was fragile. Too fragile to risk breaking. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of our story. For now, though, it was enough. Noah was safe. Liam was healing. And Claire. Claire was still out there, somewhere. The rest could wait.